Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast that explores how AI is changing media, journalism, and content creation. I'm Pete Paschal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people building how news and media will work in the future. Today, I'm excited to talk to Robert Caulk. Rob is the founder of Emergent Methods, and he's been working in AI and machine learning for quite a while now. But ever since ChatGPT came on the scene, he's been directing his energy toward applying AI to the news with an app called AskNews. So, what can you do with AskNews? Well, exactly what the name says. You can literally have a conversation with topics in the media and get custom summaries on everything from what happened in the markets today to who's been cast in the latest Jurassic Park movie. Sure, you can do that with any chatbot, but AskNews has a few things going for it. For starters, it's open source, and its AI is tuned specifically for news, not just how to find it, but how to analyze it, breaking down articles into facts, analysis, and yes, bias. It doesn't judge, though. It'll simply present contradictions between sources and let the reader make up their mind who's right. And of course, with the power of AI, language is no barrier. Rob and I talked about how journalists and newsrooms could benefit from an AI driven analysis layer on top of whatever's happening in the world, and how they could use that to tell better stories and potentially even weed out bias in their own coverage. Be sure to listen to the end where Rob tells me how he got religion on open source AI and at least where transparency is the number one goal. And as always, if you enjoy the convo, I'd encourage you to share it with a friend or a colleague, and I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the Media Copilot newsletter if you haven't already done that. Link in the show notes. I'd also really appreciate it if you'd leave a rating and review in whatever podcast app you're in. Those really do help the show get in front of more people. Lastly, you can check out everything we offer, including AI training classes for media and PR professionals at mediacopilot.ai. Okay, now on with the show and my conversation with Robert Caulk, founder of Emergent Methods and AskNews. Rob, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
Cool. I'm excited to talk to you. I know, unlike some of my other guests, you have been working in AI for a long time and, predating what we think of today as AI and all the things ChatGPT created. What is it, 2 years now? Something like that? Only 2 years? Isn't that unreal? It feels like it's been 10 or something.
The pace of
But
innovation's fast, that's for sure.
yeah, it's been nuts. And you've definitely jumped all over it. So Ask News is very impressive. I use it. It's starting to become more and more part of my day to day as I research things. Everyone I show it to you is impressed by the platform. But rewind a little bit before we talk a little bit about Ask News. Tell me about yourself. Your background. Like I said, you've been working in tech and AI for a while, but what was the pivot point of, Chat GPT? What did that do for you? And then how did that lead to what Ask News is today?
Sure. Personally, I have an academic background, so I spent a lot of time doing a master's, PhD, really diving into research, focused on computational mechanics, but really just software, scalable software, and understanding how to, algorithmically solve really large scale problems. And after I finished my PhD, it was either stick to a super esoteric computational mechanics problem or continue some of my hobbies in machine learning. And that's what I did. I jumped in and I found a really cool group of open source developers that tagged along. And we came across news as a really interesting data source. My dad is an editor for the Rocky Mountain News for 20 years, was a journalist for 20 years before that. So I've always been kind of steeped in journalism and, ethics in journalism. And so that kind of all came together in one spot. And we said, hey, let's see what kind of tech there is. This was right when ChatGPT swooped onto the scene. We said, let's leverage it. Let's see what it can do. Llama 2 came out and really enabled a lot of edge compute where we're doing, how do we read these articles? How do we extract information from articles? And that enabled...
When you say edge compute, you're talking about, like actually doing AI on your machine as opposed to the cloud, right?
Yeah, well, in some ways, essentially, when you're kind of sitting at a data source, which could be an article or some web page, what can you do at that spot? And adding intelligence right there, turns out you can really open up a bunch of information. What kind of facts are being reported here? Who's saying it, and why are they saying it? That sort of information was really difficult to extract 3 years ago. And then Llama
Mm,
2, Llama 3.1, they all came on the scene and started allowing us to do it at scale. If you run everything through OpenAI, it kind of costs a ton of money. It's also
right,
closed
right.
source and difficult to track. But in any case, it all came together and allowed us to create this company, Emergent Methods, which produces Ask News, and there's just
Mhm.
a ton of research to do. So we really leverage our academic backgrounds. How do we take the scientific method and apply it to reducing bias, to improving diversity, to considering cultural perspectives that may not have been considered before?
So was that the goal going in terms of are you looking to sort of solve some of the problems that are either inherent to how news is done today or just have gotten exacerbated in the last several years? You identified, bias. Obviously, that's a huge problem, not only within AI, but certainly within the media. And there's always sort of the uh, problem of being under resourced and having just too much information to for humans to process in a comprehensible way. Basically, take me through it. What were the problems you were looking to solve with Ask News?
With in particular, yeah, we said, hey, I think that these tools enable a new problem to a new solution to an old problem, which is um, adding a lot more intelligence at that level of distillation and parsing and collection of information. Where before AI, it was we're trying to parse through different languages, but translations are difficult to add to the same retrieval system, and we can talk more about that if we want. Um, we're
Yeah,
trying to
definitely interested in the
understand,
language.
how
Mm.
different how to pit different sources against each other to extract things like contradictions and alignments between these things was a lot more challenging when you're looking at thousands of sources and thousands of web pages. Now we said, hey, I think we can let's throw our hat in the ring and see if we can try to solve this while sticking to journalistic standards. And one of the funnest parts of this is when you're using Llama at the edge, when Llama is sitting there reading an article for you, you can
Mhm.
ask it, hey, extract the important people from this, extract the important facts. Where's the attribution? Are these allegations? If they are allegations, explain the allegation. Those sorts of things were just completely not possible. So for us, we said, if we can do that, what does that open up? Like what
Mhm.
if we can do that for journalists, and journalists can come and then look at this meta reporting, right? Of, okay, Ukraine says this, Sweden says this, France says this, US is reporting this. These are the differences. What does that open up? And I don't think we've answered that
Mhm.
question yet. I think we're still early on what it opens up. But one of the best parts of it is underneath us, everything's upgrading. We started with Llama 2,
Mhm.
and now we're on Llama 3.1. There will be a Llama 4, there will be a Llama 5. And so we kind of
Mm.
rise with the tide.
That's really cool. I'd love to zero in on just the exactly what Ask News is doing
Mm,
because I think it's going to be really relevant to a lot of my listeners in that what you just described. It's looking at a news story and really trying to understand it, extract crucial information, and separate fact from
sure.
opinion or analysis. And then once it's done that to one article, it can do it to basically every article it can find on the same topic or event and then do sort of this I don't know what you call it, but some kind of like umbrella comparison and then synthesize what it's essentially about, right? And then that sort of level of analysis is what's surfaced in your UI. And not only that, of course, you can go into sort of a granular level if you see that certain stories do have contradictions.
Mm.
Like one story says this happened, and then another story says, oh, actually, it might have happened, but it means something entirely different or something. And so you can sort of go into that.
Yeah.
And so given all, well, first of all, is that accurate? Like, is that basically like that's how I sort of have interpreted it? But like, given that it's doing that, one, is that sort of scratching the surface? And two, like, what do you do with that? What do you find is sort of the killer app for
Mm.
your customers?
Yeah, that's more or less exactly what's happening. We're tracking as many open web articles as we can, and we take them and we cluster those. So when we
Hmm.
go to an article, we say, all right, what is this about? Who are the key people? What are the key locations? The evidence. We try to structure that piece of information. We assign geo coordinates to it. We assign, um, you know, what we believe where we believe the source originates, which is actually a very difficult thing to extract, because not every source says, hey, we are from the US or we are from France. So we assign a bunch of metadata to each article that we've read. We do that for 500,000 per day. And at that point, we're able to then cluster them. And we do that because a lot of AI tools, especially open source ones, allow you to do what's called an embedding. And that's basically a fancy word for taking a lot of text and turning it into a vector of numbers. And if you can do
Right.
that for 500,000, you have 500,000 vectors. You can compare vectors mathematically quite easily and cluster them. And you can say, okay, all of these vectors have semantic similarities. They sit here. We're going to call this one topic, and that topic may be Israel Palestine. And this topic over this cluster might be Russia Ukraine presidential election. You get the point. But once you do that, if you look inside of one of those clusters, you say, all right, inside of this cluster, we have a distribution of countries, a distribution of languages. So competing perspectives live inside of one of those clusters. So that's where we can enforce diversity and enforce this competing perspectives and say, let's do a meta report on this. So it's really meta news. We're not generating
Hmm.
any new news. We're reporting on what the news reports. We're saying, here's what we see from today. Let's take Russia, Ukraine for an example. Well, we're not going to report on this particular piece of the conflict only using Russian sources. We can enforce the competing perspectives here, and we can take Russia, we can take Ukrainian sources, French, Swedish, Italian, Mexican, and that becomes really powerful for identifying those alignments. And the
Hmm.
LLM really, once you take, hey, I have all of these different sources from different languages and countries. Now, here's what we know about them. Going back to the metadata we extracted when we read them, these are the facts and the people, the key people that each one represents for this particular news report. Now, you leverage that high intelligence that you've seen with GPT-4o and say, hey,
Hmm.
find the contradictions on 100 of these things, right? So
Right.
that's a very, very time consuming and laborious process for a journalist to go through. Again, we're talking different
Yeah.
languages, we're talking different, just everything is different about all of these reports. That's where we leverage up on the final really high intelligence LLM, if it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the contradictions are probably one of the most useful things about it because it gives you, obviously a highlighting. And again, it doesn't come in and judge which one's right and what's wrong. It just sort of identifies a conflict.
Hmm.
And then you can, as a journalist, go in there and realize, well, why is this the contentious part? Maybe that's the next story on this topic is within that contradiction, right? That seems to be like a really good guide. I want to probe one of the things you mentioned
Sure.
because I think you use the term enforce diversity, which I think might be a little triggering to some people. Can you just unpack what you mean by that?
Yeah, so at Emergent Methods and Ask News, one of our key mission statements is maintaining trust, transparency, and diversity. That doesn't mean black, white, Asian, whatever. I mean that
Hmm.
it kind of comes out in the wash. What it really means is we understand that there are different perspectives in the world, and each perspective is going to report on a topic differently for some reason. Each one has bias. And so as if you can kind of smooth out that with diversity by enforcing, hey, I'm definitely going to take a representation from France. I'm definitely going to take a representation from Russia, and I'm definitely going to take a representation from Ukraine. That is an enforcement of diversity. So we're not saying it's a bit different from maybe the triggering thing would be DEI. It's very different from DEI. I'm not saying anything about right or wrong with DEI. I'm saying it is a completely different idea, if that's kind of what you were asking.
No, I get it, because in the context that Ask News is doing it, it's important to have a whole bunch of different perspectives. In fact, that's the entire point. It seems to me like the whole idea is to get out of whatever bubble you might be in. I know that's not like what you might say is the purpose of it, but it is obviously a feature, a major feature of this whole thing, that you get a very holistic look at a topic, and then you can sort of decide which direction to go in with that more complete picture. Super useful. I find it super useful. But I'm one guy. I'm actually really curious. Who are your customers? Obviously, it seems like journalists would be an obvious one, but what are some non-obvious ones?
A lot of they're news geeks. These are people who they have a sense of what it means to algorithmically enforce this sort of thing, and they're not afraid of it, right? So there's a lot of people, rightly so, who might be afraid of an algorithmic enforcement of diversity, because that's what we're talking about. At the end of the day, this is algorithmic enforcement. Even the LLM itself is an algorithmic enforcement of that meta reporting. There are people who find that compelling. They find that freeing, because it's not, people aren't coming to us as the only source of information. It's complementary to a nicely balanced news diet, right? Because it makes a ton of sense to go subscribe to the New York Times and read these specific scoops and these very, very deep dives, 20-page articles. That's very, very healthy part of the news diet. But there are people who want a quick global view of information and really find it comforting that it's not coming from an individual person, that there was no human besides our editor who's just maintaining journalistic standards, who's deciding what's said and what's not. It's a complete meta-narrative. And so there's a surprising number of people who like to do that. They like to talk to the news. So we have the ability to talk at the news and get your information that
Tell
way.
me about that. Is that kind of a killer app here? Tell me how people are using that, and what would be like the actionable insights you might be able to get out of something like that.
There's a ton. People use it for fact checking. We have people, there's so many we see so many people using it for so many different things. People use it to write a newsletter, something as simple as that, right?
Well, first, sorry, let's rewind a bit. Tell me, I know I got excited about it because I've used it before, but it's like, tell me exactly what they're doing. So is it like you're on a story or a topic and then you have a question about it? Or, I think you can do that, and you can also like just ask broadly, like from your sort of raw chatbot, like, tell me about this topic, right? Like, and then give me just, like, well, how do people, what does it do, and how do people typically use it?
So there are both. We have an analyst's tool called Newsplunker, and that's designed to really let you tune into a topic and talk directly to a topic, and inject your human intelligence into what it is you're talking to. And we call this graph chat because we're building a news knowledge graph. A lot of that metadata I was talking about extracting was relationships. So this person has this relationship to this person, or this person has this relationship to this organization. So that builds out a graph, a knowledge graph is what we call it in the artificial intelligence world. We're building that for all news. And so with Newsplunker, you can talk to a graph. You can say, hey, I've built my graph. This is a topic about energy markets or whatever. And now I want to ask questions, which energy form is most likely to see the biggest market share increase in 2025? That would be talking directly to a topic. But we do have the ability to just talk to the whole graph instead of you focusing in on your tuning in. And in that case, people ask any questions they want. And I'm always surprised. Like, one interesting use case that came out of nowhere was in Metaculus. This is a forecasting platform where people go and they try to forecast events. And it turns out it's kind of hard to resolve these things, to reconcile a forecast. And so one good use is to go say, hey, is this forecast reconciled yet? One example would be, will the House of Representatives be Republican or Democrat majority? And so you could go ask the global chat, has the House of Republicans been decided, or has the House been decided majority Republican or Democrat? It's a bit of a fact check. It's a bit of a reconciliation of information, which you could go try to find that information elsewhere, but we can get it to you. And we cite every possible source of where we found it so you can follow through. And that's a key piece of the puzzle for sure.
Nice. Just kind of rewinding a little bit to where we were talking about earlier in the whole diversity and the umbrella topics. Like, I think what you were zeroing in on there of having a bit of assurance of a platform that is trying to be tuned to give you kind of like the unbiased and holistic look at topics. And not to get too philosophical, but coming out of an election where, obviously it was very divisive, and there was what I think people are kind of correctly, at least partially correctly, seeing as a repudiation of certain of media and sort of their influence. Um, how do you feel about tools like Ask News and AI broadly as kind of a path back? Maybe not necessarily the solution, but it does seem like that's if not a desire by individual news consumers, it seems like a need in our discourse of some kind of almost like an arbiter, right? And I don't want to exalt AI as that, right? Because obviously it has its own issues, and you could probably tell me about them better than I know them. But I do feel like we're kind of stumbling towards something that is more of a impartial arbiter of news than sort of relying on your trusted gatekeepers, I guess, is what they've been traditionally called. I don't know where that leads, but I do feel like the technology is opening that possibility.
I believe it is. I had this very strange problem right before the election, which was, personally speaking, I really felt, hey, I think that the Democrats are going to win, because I consumed a lot of information from the mainstream media, as well as everywhere else, and Ask News. But our bot forecasted Trump would win, and I thought, well, that's interesting, because we've put so much energy into trying to level and diversify and get and ensure that information is as clean as humanly possible, and it's at odds with what I personally believe. And so I was completely in disagreement with our own data, and that was really interesting to try to reconcile. And then obviously after the election finished, I revisited, and I thought, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I understand.
Well, I called it.
Yeah, I understand it. And so maybe looking back at the reasoning that it used when we went and asked, basically we just asked, hey, who's going to win the election? The reasoning that it used really was pretty clear, which was, there's likely going to be underestimated Republican turnout, and there are a couple other. And so I think if people are open-minded, like these news geeks I'm talking about, who are open-minded to an algorithmic presentation of the information, it could help. But I'm not entirely convinced that there's a large portion of society who is open to it. So I think that's the key problem. It's the other thing on this point, and a little philosophically speaking, there are these other news apps which I also like. One is Ground News. I like the idea. I think they're well intentioned. But one of the key problems I see with something like with Ground News, which we try to do very differently, is that they define the political leaning of the source a priori. It means that
Right. I see.
they're not allowing Fox News to report something that maybe a Democrat would agree with. They've already
Right.
decided Fox News is Republican before you've entered and read the article. So you see the article and you say Fox News is reporting on it and it must be right-leaning. That to me is a failure, and it's actually reinforcing bias. It's not eliminating bias. And so,
Yeah, it's almost like judging by reputation, which is generally a no-no in the justice system. But I hear you, and I know this is more of an industry now because there is so much bias in media. But there's another app, I think it's a service called All Sides, and it's getting a little. I don't know if it works exactly the same, but I do know they make distinctions sometimes between editorial pages and news, right? So like something like the New York Times editorial page would probably lean very left, but the news would be a little more in the center. And so I think you need again, but maybe I think what you're saying is that prejudgment, or like you almost want to start clean with every article. Is that sort of where you were going with that?
yeah, and I pulled this from our editor because again, I'm an expert in the tech and I'm learning the journalism, but our editor is really focused on, hey, what does it when you report on a story, how do you keep this person engaged to get through all of the information? And I think a
Hmm.
lot of what you see with ground news, or maybe I haven't seen the all sides, but they're predisposed before they've even entered that this is going to be right leaning because there's too many right
Right.
leaning outlets. But the truth is, whether we like it or not, actually, Fox News has some reports that are perfectly reasonable reports, or even RT, right? We're talking
I'm glad you
like
said
propaganda
some.
networks,
I'm sure they're flattered. You go on.
but even RT, propaganda networks, and
Yeah.
we've gotten some pushback on why do you even allow RT? Well, first of
Right.
all, they're open web and it's information that's up and it's coming from someone for a reason. So at
Mhm.
no point do we say RT is always right. The information coming out is fact. A lot of times they crop up in the contradiction. So they're different from what all these other sources are saying. Doesn't mean it's fact or fiction, but it means, hey, we're just presenting to you that this is being said by this outlet. And I think it's up to you to decide how you want this information to inform your belief on the topic, or how you continue your research
Mhm.
path on this topic.
It's a fascinating direction we've gone in here, and I have one more question on this question of bias, and then I want to switch topics.
Sure.
But um, if theoretically or hypothetically, that if a media outlet wanted to be a little more self-reflective going forward and want to understand potential bias in its stories and its overall reporting, um, could they use in a systemic way Ask News to kind of try to sort of get a better sense of the bias in their coverage, and then get some actionable insights on potentially correcting that? It seems like that could be a use case.
Absolutely. I mean, the University of Texas use Ask News for aligning misinformation, essentially. So they have the U Autonomy Lab in U Texas, really good laboratory doing great research. One of their primary topics is how do we actually align misinformation or detect misinformation or understand what needs to be presented to fix misinformation.
Hmm.
And so this research includes using Ask News. And so we have a programmatic API where their system will take a post from Reddit and then find all of the diversified sources related to it and say, how does this post relate to what we know? And you can do that as a
Hmm.
media outlet, right? As a reporter, you can say, hey, here's what I'm trying to write. How does it fit? Does it fit in? Is it an outlier? Do you want it to be an outlier? These are really,
Hmm.
really interesting questions. And just to cap it, part of what you can do with this programmatic interaction, you can you can say, hey, I only want to look at sensational reporting, or I only want to look at subjective reporting, and that allows you to really tune in to what's happening in the sensational reporting side of the world. And again, that is the metadata we extract at that edge where we say, hey, what are the facts? What's the reporting voice? How is this information being presented? That piece allows us to then filter on it in the future for very, very important purposes like the U-Texas one.
Nice. Um, so you touched on sort of open web a couple times, and so that sort of naturally leads me to ask to one of the most sort of contentious areas of AI right now, which is copyright
Hmm.
and the training and the application of models on copyrighted content. Obviously, a big issue in media right now, still somewhat unresolved, even though certain deals are being made and an economy starting to emerge. Um, Number one, with regard to how Ask News works, is that first of all an issue with you guys? Obviously, you're looking at open web. It's an analysis tool, and I think generally probably it's not being used to like bypass copyrights or something like that. But I mean, you tell me, how do you see that issue with regard to the work you're doing?
We're watching closely, and it's about identifying, what do publishers want, right? And how to help publishers. And one of the key pieces is, how do you present the information in a way that people will click through, right? And so
Hmm.
citing information is really important, and making sure that even if this was open web, and that you still cite that information. So that's a key component of it, and I think that that's missing from some other platforms. Um, there's also licensed sources, and we do have licensed sources as well. And
Mhm.
those are great because we have a paid tier, and that allows us to direct money back to these licensed sources. Um, so we're following it closely. I think we can dive a lot deeper into what is training and what is inference, and
Right.
what is synthetic and what is not, and what is a sufficient transformation. When we start talking about the word copyright, the word
Yeah.
sufficient transformation comes into play. And so I think all of those are a massive gray zone, which is only going to be resolved by what people believe and want in the industry. That's our opinion.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So to be clear, if I'm a publisher and I'm interested in your tool, and being not just using it but having our content surfaced in it, there's a means to do a licensing agreement, and whether or not it's paywalled or not, I guess you just kind of work out those details on exactly what is surfaced, what metadata is read, et cetera, et cetera. That's all.
Yeah, so
Um,
most of our licensed
yeah.
sources come through that Newsplunker analyst tool, and
Mhm.
that allows us to direct more money back to that licensing, because the analyst tool costs more, essentially. But some
Mhm.
of what's, presenting the actual raw content is a lot different from presenting an interpretation of it, especially when we're talking about,
Sure.
Arabic and German sources. So even just the translation itself is almost a sufficient transformation in the eyes of a copyright infringement. Now, that would, if you still probably don't want to just post the translation directly on a website and call it a day. What we do is,
Probably.
we're translating all of this information, and then we're trying to get you a distillation. And a lot of times the only thing that surfaces for one article is a sentence. So if you want to really follow up on where that sentence came from, you have to click the citation to follow through after that sentence, to get to the original article. If you can read the
Yeah.
German once you get there, that's up to you, or translate in your browser. That's beyond us. But
Well, I'm glad you brought up language because I'd just like to ask you, like, how much of a killer app is that in a tool like this? Because I always think about previous, as when I was reporting on tech, a lot of news would break out of Asia, and sometimes the source would be in Chinese. And yeah, there was Google Translate, but there was no sort of broad way I could scan in another language, right? And now with AI, there is. It just feels like that we're kind of just at the beginning of utilizing that in terms of news discovery.
I think that's one of our biggest strengths, and we devote a lot of processing to other alternative languages besides English, approximately 60%. We have a transparency dashboard, so anybody can go click and follow at any given moment in time how many uh, different languages we're processing, and which sources we're following. Um, So to me, that is a really big strength compared to some, you could say competitors from the past and what they were capable of doing. So for sure, and that's where a lot of our analysts are saving so much time, is just getting all of this distilled in one location and then doing your research. So a lot of the manual labor before of compiling and finding and translating is completely finished, and now it's okay, thinking abstractly about how do I research this topic and present this information, instead of, like you said, translating and tracking and trying to surface it.
Nice. So what's on the horizon now? There's a lot of excitement about tools like Google Notebook LM. We hear a lot about agents. You have your dashboard and your new Splunker, and being able to talk to news. What's the next thing for Ask News?
Good question. The beauty of working in this AI industry is the options are almost endless. It's a double-edged sword. So what it boils down to is, did you make the right choice? It's not your for
Yeah.
lack of choice. It's did you make the right decision? We're listening to our current customers. One of our top customers is Riley Risk, and they're doing global security risk analysis, and it's a firm of analysts, and they give a lot of good feedback about what they need and why they need it. So for example, one feature we're developing for on the horizon is customized alerts, and making these things super shareable on the fly. So for example,
Mm,
they have one analyst tracking Israel-Gaza conflict, and a lot of times what happens is all these NGOs will open up a WhatsApp group for a certain specific situation that just emerged and share information there. And that maybe it's Telegram or WhatsApp, depending on what's occurring. But being able to share that information on the fly and share alerts into those rooms, these alerts should be very customized and very informative. And so I think natural language alerts is one of our really big next steps on top of this news plunker, these topics where you can, I'm building my Israel Gaza topic, but alert me if there's a
mm.
strike in this region, right? And that alert gets sent immediately out to these NGO WhatsApp groups, and with a link to all of that research and all of that translated and distillation, and they can immediately get it and move forward with whatever reaction they need.
Oh, wow, that's very very cool. Um, you mentioned open source since the beginning. It seems like you guys have religion on that to some extent. I know you've criticized some closed source models earlier, but can you tell me sort of fundamentally why do you think open source is the way?
I think it's a combination. That for transparency, we do need to open source our models. So a lot of
Mhm.
the models that we use, we've trained ourselves and open sourced,
Right.
and that's for transparency. That's so that you can see our entity extraction is unbiased and diversified, and here's the scientific proof to demonstrate it. And that is what is when you
Got it.
interact with Ask News, you get that. So I think for transparency's sake, especially in the real-time information distribution world, which is what Ask News is, I think it's really important to be operating with open source. Um,
Yeah.
but I don't think that it makes sense to operate without open source entirely. I think it makes sense to give people the option, especially at the end of the whole pipeline. A lot of open source LLMs are called for the enrichment of the information and the storage. But then when you come in and you want to do some super high level questioning of a graph, to me, if you want to put that into a closed source model and you trust the bias on that model, that makes sense to me. So I think there's some healthy balance.
Makes sense. So as we wrap things up, I'm super curious, like outside of obviously your job, how are you using AI day to day in your work or just your
A
life?
lot. I think our company is a good example of what a company born in AI can leverage. I think we're operating at the level of 20 people and we're five. And I only say that
Mm,
because there's a lot of moments in the company, we have a front end specialist who's super smart and super good at what he does. But there's a lot of moments where, hey, we want to tweak this one thing in the app and it's kind of small and I don't know how to do it, but I can ask AI to help. And so when I do that, AI, helps me actually do this tiny thing. I don't have to bother the specialist. He keeps working on the big things, the alerts and the really high level things. And that just really accelerates us. So to us, we use it a lot for that purpose, just especially broadening and being a generalist and doing a lot of things.
Nice. Rob, this has been a great conversation. Thanks so much. Where can people reach out to you if they want to learn more about Ask News?
I appreciate it. Yeah, come over to asknews.app and use it as much as you want and give us some feedback. I have a LinkedIn. It's Robert Caulk. We also have a really active Discord. And if you come to Discord, you can chat with us. There's a lot of news geeks. We have a lot of tools inside of the Discord where you can build your own knowledge graphs about news. You can build your own forecasts. You can do a ton of fun things. So those are the key conduits for reaching us. But no, I appreciate you having me. It's always fun to talk to people who are specialists in the media like yourself.
Oh, thank you. And I gotta say, the Discord thing is triggering for me, though. I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm like, whenever I hear Discord, it sounds like homework. I will say, having an agent that could go and do Discord for me would be a great product.
Maybe that's
maybe
that's a great product.
Okay, so it's asknews.app. And I would definitely recommend anyone listening, if you like it, ask about the new Splunker dashboard. It is pretty awesome. I check it every day on the topics I'm interested in. Rob, it's been great. Take care.
Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Robert Caulk. If you like what you heard, please just take a minute or two to leave a rating or review for the Media Copilot in your podcast app. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Media Copilot newsletter and check out mediacopilot.ai for our classes on AI for journalists and content creators. Be seeing you in the future.